Schweinfurt, Germany, October 14, 1943. The sun had not yet burned the pale autumn haze from the Rhine Valley when Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke crossed the frost-stiff grass at Wiesbaden airfield and climbed into the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6. The ground crew worked with practiced speed and a hint of urgency that didn't require explanation. Intelligence had warned through the night. A major American raid was inbound, not routine, not the usual few hundred. Possibly the largest yet, they said, words chosen carefully by men who had learned to be economical with hope. Knoke knew this dance. He had flown dozens of intercepts against the 8th Air Force, learned the geometry of bomber boxes, the way a hunter learns the curve of a stag's ribs. He knew where a B-17 was strongest and where it bled. German tactics were set down like a catechism. Attack head-on from 12 o'clock high, dive fast through the leader's fire, aim for the cockpit and wing roots, brake hard before the crossfire tears the aircraft apart, climb, reset, repeat. Skill, nerve, and timing had kept him alive. But as he pulled the canopy forward and the metal latch met home with a final sealing click, something else crept in. A stillness on the field and in the headset that felt like the moment before a storm decides what kind of storm it wants to be. The squadron, 12 Bf-109s, lifted cleanly into the thin October light, propellers biting at cold air as they climbed towards 25,000 feet. Radios crackled with control calls and bearings. Then the numbers began to arrive. First report, 300 bombers. A pause that felt longer than it was. Correction, 400. Another voice, tighter, thinner, 500. In cockpits across central Germany, men raised eyebrows, not because they doubted the threat, but because human eyes are suspicious of numbers that large. Radar could exaggerate. Ground observers could double count. Veteran pilots trusted what the sky told them when they broke cloud. At 25,000, the sky told them everything at once. Contrails emerged first, white chalk strokes cross-hatching the blue from horizon to horizon. Then the shapes resolved. B-17, flying fortresses in tight defensive boxes, layered in altitude, staggered in depth, marching across the firmament with a discipline that looked mechanical from a distance and felt implacable up close. The horizon wasn't there. Where it should have been stood a wall of aluminum and will. Knoke pressed his transmit key. "How many do you count?" The reply came back slow and honest. "I stopped at 300. It didn't matter that the principal formation attacking Schweinfurt numbered 291 B-17s. It didn't matter that accompanying streams and support aircraft pushed the total over 1,000 American planes over Germany that day. What mattered was the sense, shared instantly and without instruction, that this was no mission. This was an armada. Germany had perhaps 800 single-engine fighters to defend the entire Reich that morning. Even if every aircraft could be in 2 places at once, they would still be outmatched. The arithmetic was not a secret. The United States had spent 1942 to 43 building airfields, factories, replacement depots, fuel lines, and training pipelines. But arithmetic on a briefing map and arithmetic written across the sky in contrails are different kinds of truth. For men like Knoke, the second truth lands with weight. It becomes weather. It becomes fate. Doctrine, not despair, decided what happened next. Knoke rolled into his first attack. Nose down. Throttle forward. The Bf-109 shuddered as speed rose in the thin air, the gun sight ring settling on the lead element of a fortress box. He committed at the right moment and fired a short, disciplined burst. Cannon shells walked across a B-17's nose and into the wing root. Plexiglass blossomed into shards. Paint and metal peeled away in a dirty vapor trail. For a heartbeat, it looked like victory. Then the bomber steadied, held station, and kept moving, its gunners already feeling out the angles on a German fighter that had dared to fly in front of an army. He broke through a storm of .50 caliber tracers and hauled into a brutal climb, blood heavy in his legs and vision narrowing at the edges. No time for triumph, no time for fear. He rolled again, found another angle, and cut into his second attack run. Another burst, more hits, smoke, the sickening satisfaction of metal surrendering to force, and still the formation held. He could feel the mathematics in his bones now. Even a perfect pass was a whisper against a choir. He shoved the throttle for a third run, knowing his margins were disappearing. Ammunition was nearly gone. Fuel, burned by repeated high-power climbs and dives in thin air, was dropping fast. He chose a target, fired his last rounds, and saw fragments jump from the wing, the fortress sagging slightly before recovering into its place in the box. By the time the cannon clicked empty, Knoke had damaged 2 bombers, one possibly fatally. Under any other sky, on any other day, that would have been a clean sortie for a disciplined pilot. Under this sky, it was a paragraph in a book 1,000 pages long. Ammunition expended, fuel low. Doctrine and self-preservation converged on the same order: break off. He turned toward Wiesbaden, and as he did, he watched the American Armada continue east in ranks so wide the eye could not hold them all at once. He knew the sequence without being told: land, rearm, refuel, scramble, climb, intercept again. But he also knew the part no one wanted to say aloud. By the time he could launch again, the bombers would be over their targets, or already turning home. In the minutes it takes to return and refit, history moves. On the ground, the air tasted of exhaust and adrenaline. Ground crews drove fresh belts home. Fuel lines hissed. Reports bled into the ready room with the angerless finality of numbers. The bombers had reached Schweinfurt. Factories critical to the Reich's ball-bearing production shook under tons of ordnance. The cost to the Americans was savage by any traditional calculation. 60 B-17s shot down, 17 more written off, a 26% loss rate that should have ended any campaign on the spot. German fighters, too, had paid, around 40 lost airframes that could be replaced in time, but pilots who could not. There were declarations from Berlin of victory and headlines suited to the radios. Yet, in Einsammenseten, the quiet of the pilot hut, helmets in laps, gloves unwound slowly from numb fingers. A different understanding settled, heavy and private. The United States had put nearly 1,000 aircraft over Germany in a single day. Tomorrow, factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Fort Worth would begin replacing the losses. The Luftwaffe would replace some aircraft. It would not replace the men who had flown them. Mathematics does not weep, but men who read it sometimes do, even if only behind still eyes. That day altered more than a balance sheet. It changed confidence. Before October 14th, German fighter pilots still believed that skill, discipline, and aggression could bend the arc of the daylight bombing war. After October 14th, that belief began to thin. The very scale of the raid was a message. The United States was not testing a strategy, it was executing an industrial plan. The Luftwaffe would still win dogfights. German marksmen would still cut fortresses apart. But the tempo had shifted. The enemy could absorb what would cripple other nations. Weeks passed and the pattern hardened. 300 bombers one day, 400 the next. Sometimes 2 streams at once. One falling upon ball bearings, another upon locomotive works and marshalling yards. Germany had to defend everywhere, which is another way of saying it could defend nowhere with decisive strength. Then came the escort fighters that turned a difficult war into an impossible one. P-51, Mustangs with drop tanks appeared ahead and a beam of the bombers, not only guarding them, but hunting German interceptors trying to form for the head-on pass. The Luftwaffe's doctrine had always contained a risk. To strike a fortress formation, a fighter had to show itself. Now, when German pilots committed to the climb and turn, escorts were already waiting at altitude with speed and position. Aces fell. Squadrons bled experience by the week. The sky did not feel like the old arena of contest between equals. It felt like a vast factory floor that Germany had been invited to sabotage with a pocket knife. The training pipeline began to collapse under pressures that had nothing to do with courage. Fuel shortages choked practice hours. Instructors found themselves pushed to turn out new pilots with a fraction of the time Knoke's generation had received. Where once a man joined a staffel with 18 months of preparation, now it could be 6. Some reached front-line units with 50 flight hours and were thrown into daylight fights that had become mathematical exercises in mutual support and disciplined fire. Many died on their first or second mission. The Luftwaffe command knew this was a death spiral. Reduce training to fill the line. Fill the line with men who cannot survive long enough to gain experience. Replace them with men trained even less. Spirals have a geometry to them. So did the casualty charts in 1943 and 1944. The industrial disparity grew starker with every quarter. In 1944, American plants produced over 96,000 aircraft of all types. German factories managed around 40,000, numbers that do not capture the shortage of aluminum, high-octane fuel, rubber, and spare parts, or the fact that more and more of those German aircraft were rolled out under the sound of sirens and the dust of collapsing roofs. Training hours, maintenance standards, and pilot survivability are not separate categories. They are one system, and by 1944, that system was failing in places too numerous to patch. Knoke survived. Survival in that period is not a boast so much as a statistic that carries with it a weight of names. He wrote with the stripped honesty common to men who have witnessed a threshold. In 1941-42, there was confidence, achieved results, and the feeling that mastery of tactics could steer outcomes. In early 1943, there was doubt, but still the sense that determination might hold. After October 14th, he felt a colder clarity. You could shoot down bombers. You could frighten crews. You could cut losses into numbers that would make any staff officer wince. But the enemy could replace. And when a nation can replace at scale, loss changes its meaning. Even on days the Luftwaffe inflicted 5 to 10% losses on a stream, the stream kept coming. By mid-1943, that number slipped to 3 to 5%. By early 1944, it often fell below 2%. Not because German pilots had forgotten how to fight, but because American formations were larger, better escorted, and more disciplined in mutual fire. The psychology changed in small ways that matter. Attacks that once pressed deep into the boxes now broke earlier. Pilots who had flown through the guns to reach the cockpit stopped a second sooner because the crossfire was no longer a corridor. It was a wall. As the escorts improved and the training hours fell, survival required more prudence, and prudence saves lives in the short term while conceding skies in the long term. There is always a moment in wars where men realize that bravery has been asked to do a job meant for industry. For Knoke, that moment lived in his memory as the day the horizon disappeared behind contrails. He had made 3 attack runs in good order. He had expended all ammunition. He had broken off because fuel in thin air burns faster than hope. He had returned to a field where crews worked as if speed itself could challenge strategy. He had watched reports list the results. 2 bombers damaged, 1 possibly destroyed by his guns, 60 B-17s lost that day, 17 more never to fly again. Around 40 German fighters gone to smoke and wreckage. The ledger favored no one's pride, only the future's direction. He did not pretend otherwise in later pages. He did not need to. The facts speak in a voice men like him learned to hear without flinching. What followed Schweinfurt was not an immediate collapse. The Luftwaffe fought on with skill and fury wherever the calculus allowed. Pilots adjusted tactics, commanders shifted bases, mechanics performed miracles with tired engines and short spares. There were days the escorts were late, days the weather favored the defender, days when the bombers turned away, missing a chunk of their formation, and the German fields felt the old fierce glow. But those days were now exceptions, not models. The P-51 became a fact like the weather. The fuel became a rumor like spring in late winter. And the factories kept speaking with the same cold eloquence. More airframes, more crews, more missions. General Curtis LeMay would later put it simply, mass itself is a weapon, and it is unfair to say anyone needed him to explain it. Men like Knoke had read that sentence in the sky. By spring 1944, Veteran pilots were thin on the line. Replacements were thick with fear and inadequate practice. Aircraft were grounded for lack of gasoline, while bombers droned overhead unchallenged. In March 1945, Knoke wrote of watching a raid pass in high, bright order while his unit sat on the ground without fuel to climb. The last cruelty of a war that ends by taking away even a pilot's chance to try. War does not always close with trumpets. Sometimes it runs out of petroleum. October 14, 1943 remains in the record as the Second Schweinfurt Raid, and in the memory of its defenders as the day they saw the war's end written in a new language. Before that day, a German pilot could still believe the outcome might be decided in a cockpit. After that day, he knew the cockpit was a front office for a decision made elsewhere. In ore mines and refineries, in assembly lines and rail yards, in the training syllabi that turned boys into aviators with enough hours to see a second spring. Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters, captured the sentiment in a line that feels less like a judgment than a resignation. The day he saw reports of 1,000 American aircraft over Germany, he knew the air war was lost. It would take 18 months and countless dead to convert knowledge into surrender, but knowledge arrives when it chooses. Heinz Knoke survived the fighting. Survival granted him the long view, and the long view is unromantic. He did not pretend heroism had been absent. He did not mock skill or luck. He honored the men who flew and the ground crews who turned dead machines into living ones at 4 in the morning with frost in their breath. He simply refused to ignore what Schweinfurt taught him. You can fight courage with courage. You can match skill with skill, but you cannot fight industry with heroism. Not when the numbers behind the horizon are what they were in 1943. Not when the next day looks like the last day, only larger. So the story ends as it must with clarity, not flourish. A young officer steps onto a field at Wiesbaden at dawn. He climbs into a fighter he trusts. He flies to an altitude where the air bites and the world turns hard. He looks out and sees formation after formation until the words mission and raid no longer fit. He attacks 3 times and spends every round as a disciplined pilot should. He turns for home with fuel low and the day's results written in smoke. On paper, the defenders take a victory. In the sky, the future takes the larger one, and from that morning forward, every German pilot who climbs past the cloud top knows what Heinz Knoke learned on October 14, 1943. Sometimes the sky does not ask you to be brave, it asks you to understand.